By 1900, Americans were spending more money on patent medicines than on licensed physicians. Most of those medicines did not cure disease. Many contained alcohol, morphine, or cocaine. Almost none were subject to federal regulation. This was not a harmless misunderstanding. It was a national medical scam operating at industrial scale. In the final decades of the 19th century, the United States was expanding rapidly. Railroads connected coasts after 1869. Newspapers multiplied in every growing city. Mail-order catalogs delivered products to towns that had never seen a specialist doctor. Distribution infrastructure matured faster than medical oversight. At the same time, American medicine was fragmented. There was no Federal Food and Drug Administration, no requirement to list ingredients, no standardized national licensing system for physicians. Medical schools varied widely in quality. Some practitioners trained formally, others apprenticed briefly. Many Americans distrusted doctors whose treatments during and after the Civil War had often been ineffective or dangerous. Into this uncertainty entered the patent medicine industry. The term patent medicine was misleading. Most products were not patented in the legal sense. They were trademarked for branding purposes. What was protected was not a formula, but a name. The formula itself was often secret. Secrecy was the product. Manufacturers promised cures for consumption, kidney disease, nervous disorders, female complaints, liver weakness, malaria, rheumatism, and chronic fatigue. Advertisements claimed scientific authority. Bottles displayed official-looking seals. Testimonials described dramatic recoveries. None of these claims required proof. Before 1906, there was no comprehensive federal law prohibiting false therapeutic claims. States attempted limited regulation, but enforcement was inconsistent and easily bypassed through interstate mail. If a tonic was bottled in one state and sold in another, local authorities had little power to intervene. This legal vacuum did not produce disorder, it produced opportunity. The economics were simple. Production costs were low. Many formulas were mixtures of alcohol, sugar syrup, herbal extracts, and small amounts of opiates or stimulants. A bottle that cost pennies to produce could be sold for $1 or more. In rural America, that dollar represented hope. Hope scaled well. By the 1880s and 1890s, companies were purchasing full-page advertisements in national newspapers and magazines. Advertising spending by patent medicine manufacturers became one of the largest revenue sources for print media. In some publications, medical advertisements accounted for more than half of total advertising income. The industry did not operate in the shadows, it operated in plain sight. Colorful posters filled train stations. Testimonials were printed as letters. Pamphlets were mailed directly into homes. Traveling salesmen and medicine shows entertained crowds before offering bottles for sale. The performance was part of the persuasion. Industrialization made it possible to mass-produce not just goods, but claims. Claims required no clinical trials, no laboratory validation, no disclosure. A persuasive narrative was sufficient. A trademark substituted for safety assurance. Consumers were not uniquely naive. They were navigating an environment where modern regulatory standards had not yet existed. In 1900, the concept of federally enforced drug labeling had not been implemented. The Pure Food and Drug Act was still 6 years away. What existed, instead, was an expanding marketplace of medical promises. Some products provided temporary relief. Alcohol eased anxiety. Morphine dulled pain. Cocaine stimulated energy. The user felt improvement, at least briefly. That sensation reinforced belief in the product. Repeat purchases followed. Relief became revenue. The model did not depend on curing disease, it depended on sustaining demand. Chronic conditions were ideal. Fatigue, nervousness, and vague digestive complaints created ongoing markets. Advertisement encouraged consumers to interpret ordinary discomfort as treatable pathology. In this environment, the bottle was secondary. The real innovation was the system: mass distribution, brand identity, persuasive advertising, legal ambiguity, repeat consumption. Snake oil was one label among thousands. The phrase would later become shorthand for fraud. At the turn of the century, it was simply one product inside a much larger machine, a machine built on information imbalance. When claims could travel faster than verification, persuasion outpaced protection. Newspapers needed revenue, railroads needed freight, printers needed clients, manufacturers needed customers. The absence of national regulation did not stop the trade, it structured it. By 1900, patent medicines were not fringe curiosities, they were mainstream consumer goods. Entire companies were built on therapeutic promises that had never been tested. Fortunes were made not by discovering new cures, but by refining the language of certainty. This was not accidental deception by isolated individuals. It was organized commerce responding rationally to incentives. A regulatory vacuum rewards whoever can speak most convincingly. In the decades before federal intervention, the United States developed something new, a scalable medical claim industry. And once built, that infrastructure would not disappear. In 1900, the United States had no federal agency responsible for verifying whether a medicine was safe or effective. There was no standardized requirement to disclose ingredients. There was no national system ensuring that therapeutic claims were truthful. Authority over health was fragmented. Individual states passed their own limited laws. Enforcement varied widely. A product banned in one jurisdiction could be bottled in another and shipped across state lines with little interference. Interstate commerce expanded faster than oversight. The Constitution granted Congress authority over interstate trade, but before the 20th century, that power had not yet been fully applied to consumer protection in medicine. Manufacturers learned to exploit this gap. By placing production facilities in permissive states and distributing nationally by rail and mail, they operated beyond the reach of local regulators. At the same time, the medical profession itself lacked uniform standards. In the late 19th century, the United States had more than 100 medical schools, many of them privately owned and loosely regulated. Admission standards were inconsistent. Training periods varied. Some institutions required only a few months of lectures. Laboratory science was still developing as a foundation for medical education. Before the publication of the Flexner Report in 1910, no national accreditation framework existed to evaluate medical schools systematically. This inconsistency weakened public trust. After the Civil War, many Americans associated formal medicine with aggressive treatments, such as bloodletting, mercury compounds, and poorly understood surgical procedures. Mortality rates for infectious diseases remained high. Antibiotics did not yet exist. Even well-trained physicians often had limited tools to offer. In that environment, official medicine did not always appear more reliable than a branded tonic. Alternative practitioners, homeopaths, herbalists, osteopaths, and various healers competed openly in the same marketplace. Licensing requirements differed by state and were often shaped by political negotiation rather than scientific consensus. Consumers navigated a crowded field of claims without a centralized authority to arbitrate them. Information moved through newspapers, pamphlets, and word of mouth.
There was no standardized clinical trial system, no federal approval process, no mandatory testing before sale. If a bottle claimed to cure consumption, kidney disease, or female weakness, the burden of proof rested nowhere. Regulatory philosophy in the 19th century favored limited federal intervention. Industrial growth was encouraged. Railroads were expanding. Manufacturing was scaling. The national priority was economic development, not consumer verification. Patent medicine companies aligned themselves with that expansion. They registered trademarks under federal law to protect brand identity, but trademark protection did not evaluate safety or efficacy. A name could be legally defended even if the product inside the bottle had never been tested. Legal protection for branding existed. Legal protection for patients did not. Courts generally intervened only in cases of outright fraud or poisoning that could be clearly demonstrated. Vague therapeutic promises were rarely prosecuted. Phrases such as builds vitality or restores balance were difficult to challenge under existing statutes. Language became a shield. Manufacturers refined wording carefully. Absolute cures were sometimes promised, but many claims were phrased in ways that implied effectiveness without inviting direct legal confrontation. The absence of standardized definitions for disease allowed flexible interpretation. Newspapers played a central role. By the 1890s, advertising revenue was essential to the financial survival of many publications. Patent medicine manufacturers were among the largest advertisers in the country. Editors who depended on that income had little incentive to investigate the claims of their most reliable clients. Commercial incentives discouraged scrutiny. Meanwhile, consumers had limited access to independent medical information. Scientific journals circulated primarily among professionals. Rural communities relied on local newspapers and traveling salesmen for news about health products. There was no centralized public health communication system capable of countering exaggerated claims. When doubt arose, testimonials filled the gap. Printed letters describing dramatic recoveries created social proof. Readers saw names, towns, and signatures. Verification was rarely possible. The printed word carried authority in an era when literacy rates were rising, and printed materials symbolized modern knowledge. Distribution networks amplified this authority. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1669, goods could move coast to coast efficiently. By the 1890s, rail infrastructure connected small towns to national markets. The U.S. Postal Service expanded rural free delivery in 1896, further integrating remote communities into commercial circulation. A bottle produced in one city could appear in a distant farmhouse within days. The federal government did intervene in certain consumer matters. The Bureau of Chemistry, established in the Department of Agriculture in the late 19th century, conducted limited food analysis. However, its authority was narrow. It lacked the legal power to enforce comprehensive drug labeling standards. Awareness of adulterated foods and mislabeled medicines gradually increased. Reform advocates argued that national legislation was necessary. But until Congress acted decisively, manufacturers operated within a permissive environment. Permissive systems reward assertive actors. Companies that invested heavily in advertising expanded quickly. Those that hesitated were outcompeted. The absence of standardized testing reduced barriers to entry. A persuasive brand and reliable distribution channel were often sufficient to establish a national presence. Consumers were not irrational. They were responding to available signals. Printed testimonials, recognizable labels, repeated advertisements, and visible popularity. In a fragmented regulatory landscape, familiarity became a proxy for legitimacy. By the turn of the century, the United States had constructed a marketplace where therapeutic claims traveled across state lines, largely unchecked by federal authority. Regulation had not yet caught up to distribution. In that gap, the patent medicine industry flourished.
By the 1890s, selling medicine in America did not require discovering a cure, it required discovering a market. The patent medicine industry functioned less like a medical enterprise and more like a consumer goods business. Its success depended on margins, branding, and scale. Most so-called patent medicines were not patented for their formulas. Patents would have required public disclosure. Instead, companies protected brand names through trademarks. The formula remained secret. Secrecy created mystique. Mystique supported pricing. Production costs were low. A typical tonic might contain a base of alcohol or sugar syrup flavored with herbal extracts. Small amounts of morphine, opium, or cocaine were sometimes added for measurable effect. The ingredients themselves were inexpensive. Bottling and labeling were straightforward. The largest expense was advertising. Advertising was not a supplement to the product, it was the product. By the late 19th century, national brands were emerging across multiple industries. Soap, tobacco, and canned foods were being standardized and distributed widely. Patent medicines followed the same model. Uniform packaging allowed instant recognition. Repetition built familiarity. Familiarity built trust. A bottle that cost a few cents to manufacture could retail for $1 or more. In some cases, profit margins exceeded several 100%. High margins allowed companies to reinvest aggressively in advertising, which in turn increased sales volume. This created a feedback loop. The more a company advertised, the more revenue it generated. The more revenue it generated, the more advertising it could purchase. Smaller competitors struggled to match the scale of promotion. Market dominance went to those who could afford the loudest claims. Mail-order systems accelerated the model. By the 1870s and 80s, catalogs enabled direct-to-consumer sales. Customers could send payment by post and receive bottles without ever visiting a physician or even a store. This bypassed intermediaries and expanded geographic reach. Rural consumers, often distant from urban medical centers, became dependable customers. Chronic conditions were economically advantageous. Products aimed at long-term complaints, fatigue, digestive discomfort, female weakness, nervous exhaustion, encouraged repeat purchases. A cure that permanently resolved symptoms would end the transaction. A tonic that required ongoing use sustained revenue. Language reflected this logic. Advertisements often avoided specifying exact mechanisms. Instead, they used broad promises: restores vitality, strengthens the blood, supports the nerves. These phrases implied improvement without defining measurable outcomes. Ambiguity reduced legal risk while maximizing audience appeal. Some companies published booklets explaining disease in simplified terms, then positioned their product as the logical solution. Education and marketing merged. The consumer learned about illness from the same source that sold the remedy. Testimonials became assets. Letters describing recovery were printed in newspapers and pamphlets. Whether independently verified or not, they functioned as evidence within the advertising ecosystem. The name of a town, the inclusion of a signature, and the repetition of similar stories created perceived legitimacy. Scale required coordination. Manufacturers contracted with printers, shipping companies, and regional distributors. Warehouses stored inventory ready for rapid deployment. Railroads transported crates nationwide. Retailers stocked shelves with recognizable labels. The system resembled other industrial supply chains of the era. Risk was distributed. If one product failed, a company could introduce another under a different name. Formulas were easily adjusted. Branding could be refreshed. Because regulatory scrutiny was minimal, experimentation carried little downside. The absence of mandatory ingredient disclosure provided strategic flexibility.
A manufacturer could modify proportions or substitute components without informing customers. Consistency of branding mattered more than consistency of formula. Price positioning also mattered. A bottle priced too low might appear ineffective. A higher price suggested potency. Consumers often equated cost with value, especially in matters of health. Companies calibrated pricing to signal seriousness without excluding mass buyers. Competition intensified innovation in persuasion rather than in pharmacology. By 1900, the United States supported hundreds of patent medicine brands. Some specialized in regional markets, others achieved national recognition. The most successful were those that mastered the economics of repetition. Repeat advertising, repeat testimonials, repeat purchases. This was not chaotic commerce, it was organized growth. Companies analyzed which headlines drew attention, which testimonials generated response, which regions produced the strongest sales. Adjustments were made accordingly. In effect, early forms of market testing were already underway. The industry's expansion revealed a structural truth. When verification is optional, narrative becomes the primary competitive advantage. Patent medicine companies did not need to demonstrate clinical efficacy. They needed to maintain belief long enough for distribution and repurchase to occur. By the turn of the century, medicine in America had become in part a branding contest. The bottle carried liquid, the label carried authority, and in a marketplace without standardized proof requirements, authority could be manufactured.
By the end of the 19th century, the most powerful force behind patent medicine was not chemistry, it was advertising. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, goods could move across the United States with unprecedented speed. At the same time, printing technology improved and newspaper circulation expanded dramatically. By the 1890s, mass media and mass distribution were reinforcing each other. Patent medicine companies recognized this immediately. They were among the largest purchasers of newspaper advertising space in America. In some cities, medical advertisements filled entire pages. Revenue from these ads became essential to many publishers. A publication that criticized its largest advertisers risked losing financial stability. Commercial dependence discouraged investigation. Full-page spreads featured bold headlines, dramatic illustrations, and detailed testimonials. The layout resembled news reporting. Medical claims were placed beside legitimate articles, blending authority with persuasion. For many readers, there was little visible distinction between journalism and promotion. Advertising created repetition. A single reader might encounter the same product name in newspapers, posters, train stations, mail-order catalogs, and storefront displays. Familiarity produced legitimacy. The more often a claim appeared, the more established it seemed. Railroads amplified the system. Crates of bottled tonics traveled from urban factories to rural general stores. Sales agents coordinated distribution schedules with freight lines. National reach was no longer limited to major cities. Small towns became steady markets for branded remedies manufactured hundreds of miles away. The advertising message traveled alongside the product. Posters were shipped with inventory. Pamphlets were inserted into newspapers. Testimonials were syndicated across multiple regions. A successful campaign in one state could be replicated in another with minimal adjustment. This was scalable persuasion. Manufacturers refined their messaging carefully. Headlines emphasized urgency. Copy described invisible internal imbalances that required correction. Symptoms were framed broadly enough to apply to large segments of the population. Advertising did more than sell medicine. It shaped perception of illness. Readers learned to interpret fatigue, irritability, digestive discomfort, and anxiety as treatable conditions requiring bottled solutions. The advertisement defined the problem and presented the cure within the same column. Media infrastructure made this efficient.
Newspaper circulation in the United States grew rapidly in the late 19th century, supported by urbanization and rising literacy rates. Cheap printing costs allowed publishers to expand page counts. Advertising revenue financed that expansion. Patent medicine companies financed the advertising revenue. The relationship was mutually reinforcing. Editors relied on advertising income. Manufacturers relied on editorial proximity to borrow credibility. The system did not require coordinated conspiracy. Incentives aligned naturally. Competition intensified messaging tactics. Companies experimented with illustration styles, typography, and serialized testimonials. Others published educational booklets disguised as medical guides. Others offered free samples in exchange for mailing addresses, building early customer databases for repeated contact. Data improved persuasion. Regional sales reports informed future campaigns. Areas with high repeat purchases received heavier advertising saturation. Messaging evolved based on response rates, even without modern analytics. By 1900, patent medicine was not simply a product category. It was embedded within the infrastructure of American media and transportation. When claims could be printed cheaply and shipped nationally, persuasion achieved scale. The bottle contained liquid, the advertisement carried reach, and in an era where distribution moved faster than regulation, advertising became the most powerful instrument in medicine.
Before radio, before television, and long before the internet, one of the most efficient sales machines in America arrived on wheels. The traveling medicine show turned marketing into an event. By the late 19th century, rail lines and improved roads made touring practical. Performers, salesmen, and crates of bottled tonics moved from town to town on predictable routes. They targeted places where newspapers were thin, doctors were distant, and medical information traveled slowly. The show solved a problem that advertising could not always solve on paper. It created presence. A typical program mixed entertainment with persuasion. Music, comedy, juggling, illusion acts, and dramatic monologues drew a crowd. The audience did not arrive to buy medicine. They arrived to watch something rare, professional performance in a small town. Then the pitch began. The salesman would shift tone from entertainment to instruction. He described common discomforts in broad terms: fatigue, aches, indigestion, nervousness, sleeplessness, and framed them as signs of an underlying internal disorder. The language sounded medical without being specific. It was designed to fit almost anyone listening. The product was introduced as a solution, not as a commodity. Demonstrations reinforced the message. Bottles were held up like instruments. Labels were read aloud. The presenter explained ingredients in selective detail, often emphasizing herbs while ignoring alcohol or narcotics. The audience was given a story of how the remedy worked, even when the formula had never been tested. Social proof did the rest. Some shows used planted participants to deliver testimonials. Others recruited real locals by offering free bottles in exchange for public endorsement. Either method produced the same effect: visible confirmation in a setting where people recognized faces and trusted familiarity. The stage also provided a substitute for medical authority. In communities with limited access to professional care, the performance itself signaled expertise. A confident speaker with printed pamphlets, a branded wagon, and a disciplined routine appeared credible. The structure looked organized. Organization looked legitimate. This mattered because many illnesses at the time had no reliable treatment. Antibiotics did not exist. Chronic pain, infections, and anxiety were common. People were looking for relief, not for laboratory evidence. The medicine show monetized that gap. Sales tactics were designed for immediate conversion. Scarcity language was common. Limited supply was implied. The crowd was urged to purchase before the wagon moved on.
Prices were positioned as practical, cheaper than a doctor, easier than travel, available now. The business model relied on volume. A show could sell hundreds of bottles in a single day, then repeat the process in the next town. Distribution networks made resupply straightforward. Advertising materials traveled with the wagon. Posters, handbills, testimonials, and sometimes a local newspaper placement timed to the visit. It was an early form of integrated marketing. The show created attention. The pitch created belief. The purchase created reinforcement. If the formula contained alcohol, opiates, or stimulants, the customer often felt an effect quickly. That sensation anchored the story they had been told on stage. Relief validated the performance. The show was not simply entertainment attached to a bottle. It was a delivery system for credibility in places where credibility was scarce. It combined scarcity of medical access, scarcity of information, and the power of public persuasion. In the patent medicine era, the road was a marketplace, and the medicine show was a traveling institution that converted attention into trust, and trust into repeatable sales.
The effectiveness of many patent medicines did not come from rare herbs or hidden formulas. It came from chemistry. By the late 19th century, alcohol was a common base ingredient in tonics. Some products contained concentrations comparable to fortified wine or even spirits. A tablespoon could produce warmth, mild sedation, or temporary relief from anxiety. For consumers, that sensation felt like proof. Relief reinforced belief. Alcohol also preserved liquid mixtures and masked the taste of other compounds. It was inexpensive, widely available, and socially accepted in medicinal form. In communities where temperance movements discouraged drinking, alcohol sold as medicine bypassed moral scrutiny. Beyond alcohol, some formulas included opiate derivatives such as morphine. Others contained cocaine, which in the 1880s and 1990s was used in certain medical contexts as a stimulant and anesthetic. These substances were not yet tightly regulated. They could be purchased in bulk and blended into proprietary mixtures. The result was measurable physiological effect. Morphine dulled pain. Cocaine increased alertness and energy. Even small doses could produce noticeable changes in mood or physical sensation. Customers interpreted these changes as evidence that the remedy was addressing the advertised condition. Short-term improvement translated into repeat purchase. If a tonic reduced discomfort or elevated mood for several hours, the user was likely to buy it again. When symptoms returned, the bottle was reopened. The product did not need to cure the underlying illness. It needed to create enough relief to sustain demand. This dynamic introduced a secondary market mechanism. Dependence could develop gradually. Regular use of opiate-containing mixtures increased tolerance. Customers required larger doses or frequent doses to achieve the same effect. Sales rose accordingly. Revenue stability was reinforced by chemistry. Ingredient disclosure was not mandatory before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Labels rarely listed narcotic content clearly. Consumers often did not know precisely what they were ingesting. The sensation was attributed to the advertised botanical blend rather than to the pharmacological agent inside. Addiction became invisible infrastructure. Companies did not need to instruct customers to use more. The properties of the ingredients encouraged repetition naturally. What appeared to be loyalty to a brand could also be reliance on a substance. Medical professionals were not entirely absent from this landscape. Opiates and cocaine were used legitimately in certain treatments at the time. The distinction between therapeutic use and commercial exploitation was blurred with limited regulatory clarity and evolving scientific understanding. But patent medicine companies operated at scale. A single factory could distribute thousands of bottles weekly across multiple states. If even a fraction of customers consumed products containing addictive compounds, aggregate demand became predictable. The chemistry supported the economics. Relief encouraged belief. Belief encouraged purchase. Repeated purchase strengthened both revenue and brand visibility.
Advertising amplified the cycle, but the physiological effect anchored it. By the early 20th century, growing concern over undisclosed narcotics in consumer products began to surface in investigative reporting and medical journals. Reformers argued that consumers deserved transparency. Until federal legislation imposed labeling requirements, however, the system continued. The bottle promised restoration, the ingredients delivered sensation, and in the absence of disclosure, sensation was enough to sustain a national industry.
Not all patent medicine companies relied on traveling wagons and loud performances. Some built something more durable, a brand rooted in identity. One of the most successful examples was Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. Introduced in the 1870s, the product was marketed specifically to women. At a time when many medical discussions about female health were considered improper in public settings, Pinkham's advertising spoke directly to concerns described as female weakness, nervous disorders, and internal imbalance. The strategy was precise. Rather than positioning the product as a universal cure, the company narrowed its audience. Advertisements appeared in newspapers and magazines read by women. The messaging was written in a conversational tone. The authority presented was maternal rather than institutional. Lydia Pinkham herself became the brand. Her portrait appeared on bottles and in advertisements. The image projected stability, modesty, and moral respectability. In an era when many women were excluded from formal medical authority, a female figure offering guidance felt accessible. The company also encouraged direct correspondence. Women were invited to write letters describing their symptoms. Responses were sent back with advice and recommendations to use the compound. This created an early form of customer relationship management. Each letter reinforced engagement. Each reply deepened trust. The scale was significant. By the 1880s and 1890s, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was one of the best-known patent medicines in the United States. The company invested heavily in advertising. Testimonials were printed widely. Distribution reached both urban and rural markets. The formula itself contained alcohol, which produced mild physiological effect. As with many tonics of the era, short-term relief supported belief in long-term benefit. But the deeper innovation was structural. The company identified an underserved audience. It spoke in language tailored to that audience. It combined branding, direct communication, and repeated advertising into a cohesive system. This approach differed from the theatrical style of traveling medicine shows. It was quieter and more persistent. Instead of spectacle, it relied on printed intimacy. Instead of urgency, it emphasized understanding. Trust was cultivated gradually. In the absence of standardized medical regulation, identity functioned as credibility. A recognizable face on a bottle reduced uncertainty. Personal letters substituted for clinical consultation. Advertising filled informational gaps left by limited access to professional care. The product did not need to outperform competitors chemically. It needed to occupy a specific psychological and social space. By anchoring the brand to a named individual and focusing on a defined demographic, the company transformed a generic tonic into a specialized solution. It demonstrated that persuasion could be segmented. The patent medicine industry was not only experimenting with ingredients, it was refining audience targeting, narrative framing, and repeat engagement. In a market without mandatory proof standards, loyalty could be engineered. And Lydia Pinkham's success showed that the most powerful claims were not always the loudest, they were the most precisely directed. Before federal truth in advertising standards existed, branding carried more legal protection than medicine itself. In the late 19th century, trademark law was enforceable. Ingredient transparency was not. Patent medicine companies registered names, logos, and distinctive labels to prevent competitors from copying their brand identity. Courts would defend a trademark. They would not evaluate whether the contents of the bottle were effective. This imbalance shaped the market.
If a company could legally secure its brand name, it could build recognition without proving medical validity. The name became the asset. The formula remained private. Packaging evolved accordingly. Bottles were designed to look authoritative. Ornate typography suggested scientific precision. Gold seals implied official approval. Medical diagrams were printed on pamphlets to simulate anatomical knowledge. Even when no formal certification existed, visual cues implied legitimacy. Consumers interpreted design as evidence. In an environment without standardized labeling requirements, appearance substituted for verification. A carefully printed label appeared safer than an unmarked bottle. Decorative detail signaled investment. Investment signaled seriousness. Language was engineered with similar care. Absolute claims, such as cures tuberculosis, could invite legal challenge if harm was obvious. Broader phrases, supports lung strength or restores vitality, were harder to prosecute. The wording implied benefit while avoiding measurable promises. Ambiguity reduced risk. Because there were no mandatory disclosure rules before 1906, companies were not required to list narcotics or alcohol content clearly. The emphasis remained on botanical imagery and reassuring language. What was highlighted mattered more than what was hidden. Competition intensified visual differentiation. As hundreds of tonics crowded shelves, packaging became a battlefield. Color schemes, bottle shapes, embossed glass, and serialized testimonials created identity. The goal was immediate recognition in a general store crowded with alternatives. Shelf presence became strategy. Retailers preferred products with recognizable branding because customers asked for them by name. Brand familiarity reduced the need for explanation. This further rewarded companies that invested heavily in advertising and visual consistency. In effect, trust became transferable. Once a brand achieved national visibility, consumers assumed reliability. Repetition across newspapers, posters, and bottles created coherence. Coherence suggested organization. Organization suggested safety. Legal structures reinforced this dynamic. The federal government could defend a trademark against imitation, but it lacked comprehensive authority to challenge exaggerated therapeutic claims. Intellectual property protection advanced faster than consumer protection. The result was predictable. Companies optimized for recognizability rather than efficacy. Resources flowed into design, printing, and distribution instead of laboratory testing. The market rewarded whoever could appear most credible at scale. By 1900, medicine in America had become visually standardized, even when chemically inconsistent. The label projected certainty. And in a regulatory system that guarded names more carefully than ingredients, appearance often mattered more than proof.
Not every patent medicine relied on narcotics or alcohol to create results. Some relied on expectation. By the late 19th century, scientific understanding of placebo effects was limited, but the psychological mechanism was active. When a person believed a remedy would work, perception of symptoms could change. Pain felt reduced, fatigue felt lighter, anxiety softened. Belief altered experience. Patent medicine advertising cultivated that belief deliberately. Repetition across newspapers, posters, pamphlets, and storefront displays created familiarity. Familiarity reduced skepticism. A product seen repeatedly appeared established. Testimonials reinforced expectation. Printed letters described dramatic recoveries. Names and towns were included. Whether verified or not, the structure resembled evidence. Readers encountered story after story of improvement. The mind absorbed a pattern. Others recovered, therefore recovery is likely. Public performance amplified this effect. Traveling medicine shows combined entertainment with endorsement. Applause from a crowd signaled approval.
Seeing neighbors purchase a bottle reduced hesitation. Social observation became validation. The body responded within that framework. If a person consumed a tonic expecting relief, small fluctuations in symptoms were interpreted as confirmation. Natural variations in pain or energy were attributed to the remedy. Improvement strengthened belief. Belief encouraged continued use. This feedback loop required no pharmacological potency. Many illnesses of the era were chronic, cyclical, or poorly understood. Digestive discomfort, headaches, nervous exhaustion, and fatigue often fluctuated naturally. When symptoms improved temporarily, the improvement was credited to the most recent intervention. Advertising defined the narrative around those changes. By describing vague internal imbalances, companies gave consumers a language to interpret discomfort. Once the problem was defined in print, the solution appeared rational. The product felt necessary. The absence of standardized clinical testing meant no controlled comparison disrupted this cycle. There were no mandatory trials separating chemical effect from psychological effect. Personal experience became sufficient evidence. This made persuasion scalable. A remedy did not need to cure disease universally. It needed to create enough positive experiences, whether pharmacological or psychological, to sustain reputation. Even partial or temporary relief generated testimonials. Testimonials generated new customers. The system did not depend entirely on deception. It depended on expectation, operating inside a market without verification standards. In that environment, perception carried economic value. And when belief itself could produce relief, advertising did more than sell medicine. It activated the mechanism that made the medicine appear to work. By 1900, patent medicine companies were among the largest advertisers in the United States. Newspapers depended on that revenue. Advertising space often occupied entire pages. In some publications, medical ads represented a substantial share of total income. Removing them would have threatened financial stability. Economic dependence shaped editorial behavior. Criticism carried risk. Editors who challenged exaggerated claims could lose major advertisers. Publishers competing in crowded markets prioritized survival. Investigative reporting into patent medicines was rare, not because fraud was invisible, but because incentives discouraged exposure. The relationship did not require coordination. Manufacturers purchased space. Newspapers printed what paid. Readers encountered advertisements beside news stories. The visual proximity blurred distinction. Authority transferred from journalism to promotion. Layout intensified the effect. Bold headlines, testimonials, diagrams, and official-looking seals mimicked informational reporting. A reader turning a page could move from political news to a miracle cure without a clear boundary. The printed medium carried inherent trust. Repetition deepened influence. A product advertised daily gained legitimacy through persistence. Familiarity signaled stability. Stability suggested safety. The absence of public challenge reinforced perception of reliability. Competition among publishers strengthened the cycle. If one newspaper rejected a profitable advertiser, another would accept it. Market pressure favored accommodation. Revenue rewarded compliance more reliably than skepticism. At the same time, national distribution networks expanded reach. Advertising messages synchronized across cities and states. A reader traveling between towns saw the same product name repeatedly. Consistency across regions suggested scale. Scale implied credibility. The structure rewarded exaggeration. More dramatic claims attracted attention. Attention increased sales. Increased sales funded larger advertisements. Larger advertisements increased visibility. The feedback loop operated efficiently inside commercial media. Public health consequences were secondary to commercial priorities. Without federal regulation requiring evidence, newspapers had no legal obligation to verify therapeutic claims before printing them. Responsibility was diffuse, accountability was limited. This was not simply a failure of journalism, it was an economic alignment. Manufacturers needed distribution, newspapers needed revenue, readers needed information. In the absence of oversight, advertising filled the space between need and verification. By the early 20th century, patent medicine was embedded in American media infrastructure. The press amplified the claims, and amplification, sustained by revenue, allowed unverified medicine to achieve national reach.
By the early 20th century, the scale of the patent medicine industry made silence difficult to sustain. In 1905, journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams published a series of articles in Collier's Weekly titled The Great American Fraud. The investigation examined the contents of widely sold patent medicines and exposed the presence of alcohol, morphine, and other undisclosed substances. The impact was immediate. Adams did not argue from moral outrage alone. He cited chemical analysis, he referenced medical authorities, he compared advertising claims with ingredient reality. The series reframed patent medicine not as colorful folklore, but as a public health issue. For readers, the revelation altered perception. Products marketed as herbal restoratives were shown to contain narcotics. Tonics presented as gentle remedies were revealed to rely on intoxicants. The gap between label and content became visible. Other reformers amplified the critique. Progressive-era activism was already addressing food adulteration and unsafe industrial practices. Patent medicine fit into a broader concern about consumer protection. Public trust in unregulated commerce was weakening. Newspapers that had long carried medical advertisements began reporting on the controversy. The issue could no longer be ignored entirely. Discussion moved from isolated skepticism to national debate. Pressure reached lawmakers. Advocates argued that consumers deserved to know what they were ingesting. The absence of labeling requirements was framed as a structural failure, not merely a marketing excess. Reform shifted from voluntary restraint to legal necessity. The industry responded defensively. Manufacturers denied wrongdoing. Some adjusted language. Others questioned the credibility of critics. But the exposure disrupted the equilibrium between advertising and silence. The core issue was transparency. Once ingredients were publicly discussed, belief could no longer operate without scrutiny. The persuasive power of testimonials weakened when chemical analysis contradicted them. The muckrakers did not end the patent medicine trade. They changed its vulnerability. By transforming private formulas into public subjects, investigative journalism challenged the foundation of secrecy. The debate moved from individual disappointment to systemic reform. In 1905, persuasion encountered verification, and once verification entered the conversation, federal intervention became increasingly likely. In 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. The law did not immediately ban patent medicines. It required disclosure. For the first time at the federal level, manufacturers were obligated to label certain dangerous ingredients, including alcohol, morphine, opium, and cocaine. Products shipped across state lines could no longer conceal these substances entirely. Transparency altered incentives. When consumers saw narcotics listed on labels, perception shifted. What had been marketed as botanical restoration now appeared as chemical sedation or stimulation. The authority of secrecy weakened. The act also prohibited interstate commerce in misbranded or adulterated food and drugs. While enforcement was limited initially, the principle was established.
The federal government had jurisdiction over medical claims tied to interstate trade. This was structural change. Before 1906, regulation lagged behind distribution. After 1906, oversight began to track commerce. The Bureau of Chemistry, which would later evolve into the Food and Drug Administration, gained authority to investigate violations. However, the law had limits. It did not require proof of effectiveness. A manufacturer could still sell a tonic that did nothing, as long as certain ingredients were disclosed and labeling avoided outright falsehoods as narrowly defined by statute. The industry adapted quickly. Language softened. Cure became remedy. Eliminates disease became supports recovery. Companies reformulated some products to reduce dependence on narcotics that now had to be declared openly. Compliance became part of branding. A label listing ingredients could be presented as evidence of honesty. Transparency, once resisted, became a marketing asset. The market shifted from secrecy to selective disclosure. But the deeper shift was jurisdictional. The federal government had asserted its role in regulating consumer protection within interstate trade. Medicine was no longer outside national oversight. Advertising and distribution could be scrutinized under law. The Pure Food and Drug Act did not end exaggerated claims. It narrowed the space in which they operated. For the first time, the bottle carried not only a promise, but a federally recognized obligation to reveal part of its contents. And once disclosure became standard, the era of entirely hidden formulas began to close. Regulation did not end the patent medicine industry. It forced it to evolve. After 1906, manufacturers adjusted language rather than abandoning claims. The most obvious promises disappeared. Cures cancer became supports health. Eliminates disease shifted to build strength. Precision gave way to suggestion. Ambiguity became strategy. The Pure Food and Drug Act targeted misbranding and undisclosed narcotics, but it did not require scientific proof of effectiveness. As long as labels listed certain ingredients and avoided clearly fraudulent statements, products could remain on shelves. Companies reformulated selectively. Some reduced alcohol or narcotic content to avoid consumer backlash. Others maintained similar mixtures while reframing their purpose. A tonic once marketed as a cure for tuberculosis might now be described as a restorative aid during recovery. The business model remained intact. Advertising continued, though wording grew more cautious. Testimonials persisted, often emphasizing personal experience rather than medical certainty. The authority of narrative replaced the authority of cure. Legal compliance became part of marketing. Labels highlighting ingredient transparency suggested responsibility. Packaging evolved to appear modern and trustworthy. References to laboratories and scientific preparation increased, even when formal testing remained minimal. Competition intensified differentiation. As direct claims narrowed, branding, design, and emotional appeal gained importance. Companies invested more in visual identity and audience targeting. The industry moved closer to what would later be recognized as modern consumer marketing. Enforcement capacity was limited. Federal agencies lacked the resources to monitor every advertisement or shipment. Litigation required time and evidence. Many exaggerated claims continued under softer phrasing that avoided clear statutory violation. This phase revealed a structural pattern. When regulation targets specific behaviors, markets adapt around definitions. Language shifts. Emphasis changes. The underlying incentive to sell belief at scale remains. Patent medicine did not collapse under regulation, it professionalized. The industry learned to operate within legal boundaries while preserving persuasive force. Claims became less explicit, but no less ambitious. Instead of promising miracles, products promised support. The distinction mattered legally. It mattered less economically. By adapting quickly to new rules, manufacturers demonstrated that oversight alone does not eliminate incentive. It reshapes expression. The era of open cure-all declarations was fading. The era of carefully constructed wellness language was beginning.
While patent medicine companies were adjusting language, another transformation was underway. In 1910, educator Abraham Flexner published a report evaluating medical schools across the United States and Canada. The study exposed inconsistent standards, inadequate laboratory training, and uneven admission requirements. Many institutions closed in the years that followed. Medical education tightened. Universities adopted science-based curricula. Laboratory research gained priority. Licensing standards became more uniform across states. Professional medicine began consolidating authority around measurable training and institutional accreditation. This shift altered public perception. As formal medical education strengthened, the contrast between laboratory-trained physicians and commercially advertised tonics became sharper. Authority migrated from printed testimonials to scientific institutions. Hospitals expanded during the early 20th century. Diagnostic tools improved gradually. Public health campaigns addressing sanitation and infectious disease reduced mortality in some areas. Confidence in organized medicine increased. Trust began to centralize. Patent medicine companies still operated, but they no longer competed in a fragmented landscape of loosely regulated practitioners. They now faced an increasingly unified profession, capable of criticizing exaggerated claims from a position of standardized expertise. Professional associations amplified that critique. Medical journals and organized bodies such as the American Medical Association published warnings about undisclosed ingredients and misleading advertising. Criticism became systematic rather than sporadic. This was not purely scientific progress, it was institutional consolidation. As medicine professionalized, it also claimed jurisdiction over legitimacy. Products not supported by formal study were framed as outside credible practice. The boundary between regulated medicine and commercial remedies hardened. The economic structure shifted accordingly. Consumers who once relied on mail-order tonics increasingly encountered hospitals, trained physicians, and standardized prescriptions. Trust moved from brand identity to professional certification. Patent medicine adapted but lost monopoly over authority. The earlier era had allowed persuasion to substitute for proof. The new environment rewarded credentials, degrees, and clinical validation. Regulatory reform and professional reform reinforced each other. The change did not eliminate questionable remedies. It narrowed the space in which they could claim parity with institutional medicine. By the early 20th century, health in America was no longer defined solely by advertising reach. It was increasingly defined by organized expertise. And as expertise consolidated, the unregulated marketplace that had sustained the original patent medicine boom began to contract.
The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 introduced disclosure. It did not require proof of safety. That gap became visible in 1937. A pharmaceutical company marketed a liquid form of sulfanilamide using diethylene glycol as a solvent. The compound was toxic. More than 100 people died, many of them children. The product had not been tested for safety before distribution. Public reaction was immediate. In 1938, Congress passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The law required manufacturers to demonstrate safety before marketing new drugs. It expanded federal inspection authority. It strengthened enforcement powers. This was a turning point. For the first time, companies were obligated to provide evidence to regulators before selling certain pharmaceutical products across state lines. Pre-market review replaced post-market reaction. The institutional framework that would become the modern Food and Drug Administration gained sharper authority. The patent medicine era had operated on assumption and persuasion. The new framework operated, at least in principle, on documented testing and regulatory approval. However, boundaries remained. The law focused primarily on drugs presented as medical treatments. Products positioned as supplements, tonics, or general wellness aids occupied more ambiguous territory. Language continued to classification. Industry adapted again. Some manufacturers shifted toward categories less tightly defined as pharmaceuticals. Others emphasized nutritional framing rather than disease treatment. The line between medicine and supplement became strategically important. Federal oversight had strengthened, but markets respond to definitions. The expansion of authority in 1938 closed one chapter of openly untested pharmaceuticals. It did not eliminate the commercial incentive to sell health-related products outside strict medical classification. The regulatory system had matured. The incentive structure had not disappeared. Safety testing became mandatory for many drugs. Proof of effectiveness, however, would not become a requirement until further reforms decades later. The system continued to evolve in response to crisis. Each legislative milestone narrowed the gap between persuasion and verification. Yet wherever language allowed ambiguity, commercial opportunity remained. By the late 20th century, the language of patent medicine had evolved into something softer. The word cure had largely disappeared. In its place emerged support, enhance, and promote. In 1994, the United States passed the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, commonly known as DSHEA. The law created a distinct regulatory category for vitamins, herbs, and nutritional supplements. These products were not required to undergo the same pre-market approval process as prescription drugs. The classification mattered. Under DSHEA, manufacturers could sell supplements without proving effectiveness, provided they avoided direct disease treatment claims. Statements such as supports immune health were permitted. Claims such as treats influenza were not. Language again defined the boundary. Companies learned to operate within structure-function wording. Labels emphasized general wellness rather than specific medical outcomes. Disclaimers stated that the product was not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. The disclaimer became ritual. Consumers encountered bottles that looked medical, referenced scientific terminology, and cited traditional use, yet carried a small statement distancing the product from pharmaceutical regulation. Marketing adapted to modern channels. Television infomercials, magazine spreads, and later internet advertising amplified supplement claims. Testimonials returned in new formats. Before and after stories became common. Celebrity endorsements replaced traveling showmen. The economic logic remained familiar. Low production costs combined with persuasive branding created high margins. Repeat use was encouraged for ongoing support. Chronic conditions and general fatigue continued to anchor demand. Regulation had strengthened since 1906 and 1938. But differentiation between drugs and supplements reopened a space where proof requirements were lighter. As long as companies stayed within carefully phrased language, products could reach national markets with limited pre-market scrutiny. Enforcement relied largely on post-market action. If harm was demonstrated or claims crossed into explicit disease treatment, regulators could intervene, but the burden shifted toward reaction rather than prevention. The modern wellness industry did not replicate the patent medicine era exactly. It refined it. The bottles still carried promise. The language still avoided measurable guarantees. The testimonial still reinforced belief. What changed was vocabulary. What remained was incentive.
Wherever regulation draws a line, markets study its edges. And at those edges, commercial health claims continue to find space to operate.
The infrastructure changed, the logic did not. By the mid-20th century, television replaced the traveling wagon as the dominant persuasion platform. Health-related products no longer needed a physical stage. The stage entered the living room. Broadcast advertising multiplied reach instantly. A single televised message could reach millions simultaneously. Demonstrations became visual. Hosts held bottles up to cameras. Charts and diagrams appeared on screen. Authority was performed through lighting, lab coats, and confident narration. The infomercial extended this format. Long-form television advertisements combined testimonials, expert interviews, limited-time offers, and visible call-in numbers. The structure echoed the medicine show: attention first, explanation second, urgency third. Direct response marketing accelerated conversion. Toll-free numbers and mail-in forms allowed immediate purchase. Later, online ordering simplified the process further. The time between persuasion and transaction shrank. Celebrity endorsement replaced local familiarity. Public figures lending their names to products transferred borrowed credibility. Recognition substituted for verification. Visibility implied legitimacy. Regulatory frameworks remained in place. Explicit disease treatment claims risked enforcement, but carefully phrased language allowed broad promises about energy, metabolism, and vitality. As long as wording stayed within defined limits, distribution scaled. Television introduced repetition at national frequency. A viewer might see the same health product advertised multiple times in a single week. Repetition reinforced familiarity. Familiarity reduced skepticism. Production values increased perceived authority. Studio backdrops resembling laboratories, testimonials filmed in controlled lighting, and graphics referencing clinical studies shaped perception. Even when evidence was thin, presentation suggested rigor. Data improved targeting. Advertisers tracked response rates by time slot, demographic, and geography. Campaigns were refined according to measurable consumer behavior. The system became analytical. The core model endured. Low production cost combined with persuasive narrative and scalable distribution created high-margin opportunity. Chronic concerns, weight loss, aging, fatigue remained consistent demand drivers. Television did not invent health marketing. It industrialized attention. The persuasive techniques once performed in town squares now operated through broadcast networks. The audience was no longer dozens gathered under a tent. It was millions seated at home. Scale amplified incentive, and wherever persuasion could reach faster than verification, the architecture of the patent medicine era reappeared in modern form. The platform changed again. In the 21st century, persuasion moved from broadcast studios to personal screens. Social media replaced television as the primary discovery channel for health-related products. Authority fragmented. Instead of institutional anchors or celebrity endorsements alone, individual influencers became intermediaries. Fitness coaches, lifestyle bloggers, and wellness personalities built audiences based on perceived authenticity. Trust was constructed through repetition, relatability, and daily presence. The recommendation became personal. A product was no longer introduced by a distant announcer. It appeared in a morning routine, a workout clip, or a casual conversation video. The tone suggested experience rather than advertisement. Algorithms amplified reach. Platforms prioritized content that generated engagement. Emotional testimonials, dramatic before and after narratives, and confident health claims spread rapidly. Visibility was determined by interaction metrics rather than medical validation. The structure echoed earlier eras. Testimonials remained central.
Visual transformation replaced printed letters. Discount codes replaced mail order forms. The transaction moved from store counter to digital checkout in seconds. Regulation struggled to keep pace. Disclosure requirements for sponsored content existed, but enforcement varied. Claims were often framed as personal opinion rather than medical statement. Phrases such as "this worked for me" bypassed stricter standards applied to explicit therapeutic promises. Language adapted once more. Products were described as supporting gut health, boosting immunity, or optimizing hormones. The vocabulary avoided direct disease claims while implying significant benefit. Scale intensified through network effects. A single post could be shared, remixed, and redistributed across platforms globally. Cross-border sales blurred jurisdiction. International audiences encountered products governed by uneven regulatory regimes. Data refined targeting further. Advertisers could identify users searching for weight loss relief, anxiety relief, or chronic pain solutions. Messages were delivered to those most likely to respond. Personal vulnerability became a marketing vector. The commercial incentive remained constant. Low-cost supplements or wellness programs marketed through high-reach digital channels generated substantial margins. Repeat subscriptions replaced one-time purchases. Recurring billing stabilized revenue. The modern system appeared decentralized. In practice, it was highly structured. Algorithms rewarded engagement. Engagement favored bold claims. Bold claims attracted attention. Attention converted to sales. The patent medicine wagon had become a smartphone. The testimonial had become a post. And in a marketplace where persuasion moves at algorithmic speed, verification continues to lag behind distribution.
The most durable feature of the patent medicine era was not the bottle. It was the revenue model. 19th century tonics thrived on repetition. Chronic discomfort created ongoing demand. Alcohol, opiates, or simple psychological reinforcement encouraged continued use. Revenue stabilized through return customers. The modern equivalent is subscription. Health products are now sold through monthly delivery plans, auto-renewing memberships, and recurring supplement shipments. The transaction is no longer a single exchange at a general store. It is an automated cycle. Predictability increases valuation. Investors value businesses with recurring income more highly than those dependent on one-time purchases. A customer who pays monthly represents measurable lifetime value. Marketing strategies increasingly focus on retention rather than initial conversion. Language supports this structure. Products are framed as part of a routine, a protocol, or a system. Improvement is described as gradual and continuous. If results are not immediate, the explanation emphasizes consistency and patience. Time extends the relationship. Recurring billing reduces friction. Once enrolled, a customer continues receiving product unless actively canceling. Convenience replaces deliberation. The cost becomes background rather than event. Digital platforms enable tracking. Companies monitor reorder rates, cancellation timing, and engagement metrics. Messaging adjusts accordingly. Reminders, loyalty discounts, and limited-time bonuses reinforce continuity. The psychology resembles earlier cycles. Temporary relief encourages belief. Belief encourages repetition. Repetition strengthens habit. Habit stabilizes revenue. Chronic concerns remain central drivers. Weight management, aging, digestive health, stress, and energy are conditions without simple endpoints. Improvement is subjective and variable. That variability sustains opportunity for ongoing product use. Regulatory frameworks focus primarily on safety and explicit medical claims. Subscription structure itself is legal. Recurring payment is a financial mechanism, not a therapeutic one. The incentive persists.
As long as belief and partial improvement can be sustained, revenue can be extended. The bottle may change, the platform may evolve, the billing system may modernize, but the economic logic remains consistent. The original patent medicine industry discovered that health anxiety could be monetized repeatedly. Modern subscription wellness systems refined that insight. Revenue stability no longer depends on town-to-town travel. It depends on keeping belief active month after month.
Snake oil was never only about a bottle. It was about structure. In the late 19th century, the United States combined expanding railroads, mass printing, weak regulation, fragmented medical authority, and rising consumer markets. That environment rewarded whoever could scale persuasion faster than verification. Patent medicine companies responded rationally. They invested in branding, distribution, and narrative. They optimized margins. They studied audience behavior. They refined language to avoid legal thresholds. They adapted when regulation tightened. They professionalized when criticism intensified. The product evolved. The incentive did not. Each regulatory milestone, 1906, 1938, later amendments, reduced specific abuses. Disclosure increased. Safety standards improved. Institutional medicine consolidated authority. Yet wherever definitions left ambiguity, commercial health claims returned. The mechanism is consistent. A widespread discomfort exists. A persuasive explanation frames that discomfort as solvable. A product offers relief. Relief, whether chemical or psychological, reinforces belief. Belief sustains purchase. Purchase funds further persuasion. Distribution has accelerated. Railroads became newspapers. Newspapers became radio. Radio became television. Television became algorithmic feeds. Each transition increased reach and reduced friction between message and transaction. Verification has expanded as well. Laboratory testing, regulatory agencies, and investigative journalism now operate at national and international scale. But persuasion often moves first. Oversight follows. This is not a story of uniquely gullible consumers. It is a story of incentives. When regulation lags behind distribution, claims expand. When language defines legality, language adapts. When belief can produce measurable experience, marketing acquires psychological leverage. Snake oil was an early expression of a scalable claim machine operating inside a regulatory vacuum. The bottle has changed shape. The disclaimers have grown longer. The platforms have modernized. The architecture remains recognizable. Wherever health anxiety intersects with persuasive infrastructure and partial oversight, commercial opportunity emerges. The lesson is structural. Markets optimize for what is rewarded, and in the absence of clear and forcible proof standards aligned with distribution speed, certainty can still be manufactured.